Hi students, welcome to Year 11 Biology and Module 3, Biological Diversity. This is video number 2, and in this video we're going to be looking at biotic factors. The learning intention for this particular video is that you are able to predict the effects of biotic selection pressures on organisms in ecosystems. And in order for you to be able to do that, we're going to need to look at some of the ranges of different biotic interactions that occur within different environments. So this table gives us a nice little overview of some of the different interactions that occur between organisms or between populations of organisms in a particular ecosystem. When organisms or groups of organisms impact on one another, they do so in a number of different ways. Either or both species or individuals can benefit, either or both individuals or species can be harmed, or there can be a combination of harm, benefit, or no real effect at all on the individuals involved. Quite clearly, if there's no effect on either of the individuals or the species involved in a particular interaction, then they are just ships that pass in the night, and so therefore they're not a group that we would study. But for all the other types of relationships, you will see a number of different examples of the types of interactions that we see between different groups of organisms. And to help us distinguish between these, we've given them certain names. Now in this table, you'll notice that there is some redundancy that's built in. So some of these occur more than once. And so I'll try and focus my attention on each of the different groups of organisms and their specific interactions. Excuse me. The first one is where there's potential harm to both the individuals involved or to the groups of organisms that are involved in competition. So competition is about a particular type of resource. Really? So competition is about a particular type of resource. Now this resource could be a mate, it could be a food source, it could be a shelter, it could be any sort of thing that two individuals or two different species are actually competing over. Generally speaking, this is going to happen at some level of harm to both the species involved or both of the individuals involved, even if one comes out on top all the time. You may say that it benefits as the other one is harmed, but realistically the costs involved in competition for any sorts of resources are going to do some harm to the competitors in those situations. Contrast that with an example of an interaction in which both organisms benefit. We'll have a look at an interesting little example of mutualism between a fish, a goby, and a shrimp, where the shrimp seems to do nothing but excavate a little cave that both organisms can live in, but it's blind and it doesn't seem to be able to protect itself particularly well, and the fish gives it some protection by keeping in contact and making sure that it stays safe. So here is an interaction between two completely unrelated species that provides some benefit to both. How these particular relationships develop, and we see a lot of examples of this, particularly certain types of flowers, for example, that mimic so closely to the particular insects that they attract, that there is a very strong association between these two, one which is gaining food and one which is gaining the dispersal of its pollen. So there's a lot of examples that we can look at in different ecosystems that show this mutual benefit, and that's an example of mutualism. If one benefits and another isn't particularly harmed, nor does it benefit in any way, then we call it commensalism. And commensalism is probably most easily demonstrated through Dory or Nemo. And specifically because when we look at that Finding Nemo movie, we know that clownfish tend to occupy anemones. They have a relationship with anemones where The clownfish gains some benefit by being able to exist in the anemone. Certainly, it gains some protection against a larger fish that may want to make a meal out of it. But we don't really see any particular benefit to the anemone. The anemone may gain some, food if the clownfish is a messy eater, but there doesn't seem to be any particular advantage to the anemone for being involved in this relationship. But there's certainly a benefit to the clownfish. And so this is an example of commensalism. Both species involved aren't benefiting. One of them is benefiting, but one is not specifically really being harmed in any way. If the one species that isn't harmed is actually causing harm to the other rather than benefiting the other, then we have an example of amensalism. Okay, another example of that, specific example of that, is allelopathy. Now, this happens when certain types of plants, for example, may release chemicals into the soil that actually inhibits the growth of other plants. Now, you could argue that that may give them an advantage in terms of colonizing a particular area, but really it's often not so much about that. It's just a particular chemical that does actually harm other plants and stops them from growing in those areas, but usually they're produced by plants that are often well established. So there's no particular advantage to them in stopping or at least limiting the competition around them. This sort of example of a species that isn't particularly harmed or benefited in any way, but does certainly stop other plants from growing in that area, is an example of amensalism. So an interaction between two organisms where one hasn't any noticeable benefit, but another one is harmed in some way, at least unable to avail itself of a particular resource. And then there's the two examples that we're probably most familiar with, which is predator-prey relationships, which is predation, and also host-parasite, which is parasitism. Now, these two are very clearly examples of one species or individual benefiting at the cost of another. Predation is the ultimate because a predator will kill the prey in order to feed. So the predator is getting a specific benefit, it's getting food. The prey, on the other hand, is going to be specifically harmed in this interaction. In parasitism, that's not quite the same thing. The host is harmed, definitely harmed in some way. Usually the health diminishes for a host. The parasite, though, is usually fairly careful not to kill the host because the host is its habitat. That is where the parasite lives. So whilst it is benefiting, while it's getting nutrients usually, as well as some protection by living in the host, it's usually going to try and avoid killing that host. Obviously, if the parasite kills the host too quickly, doesn't have the opportunity to move on, then the parasite will die with the host. So these are some of the biotic interactions that we see, the interactions between different living things within an environment. And each of these can create specific types of pressures. Survival is always a key. And when we're looking at each of these examples, what we're trying to do is see how these interactions are helping a species survive or actually harming that species in order to prevent it from thriving in a particular area. In order to think about exactly what costs are involved in this, we need to have a look at one more ecological principle. The third ecological principle that we're having a look at for this particular video is this one. Ecological principle number 3. All organisms have a limited supply of essential resources, which must be allocated to particular structures or activities. Once the resources have been allocated, the organism must have less available for other structures or activities. Think here of a peacock. The peacock display is one of the most impressive displays of any bird on the planet. A lot of energy has gone into the production of those feathers. And the main purpose that we can see from that is to attract a mate. But as the bird allocates these resources to the building of feathers, it can't use them for other purposes, building muscles to run away or flight muscles to fly away. So therefore, there's a lot of interplay that's occurring here in terms of the peacock display and also the peacock being able to avoid predators. You want to make sure that you survive long enough to attract a mate, and when you do get that opportunity, you want to make sure that you're successful with that. But each of these strategies comes at a cost. So we need to remember that when we're analysing each of these interactions, we're looking at the fact that all organisms have a certain number of resources. Those resources need to be allocated to a range of different functions and structures and processes that are part of living, but they have to be allocated in such a way that when certain resources are allocated in one direction, they cannot also be allocated in another. And all of this is an interplay between what are the key factors that help particular organisms and, by extension, populations survive. Something for us to think about, and we'll have a look at some more specific examples in class. Thanks for watching.